On June 12, 2026, in Paris, France, Canada quietly altered the course of global geopolitics while the world was looking the other way. Mark Carney walked out of the Élysée Palace carrying a newly signed agreement that barely registered on the front pages of major North American newspapers. Mainstream media networks like CNN and BBC were completely consumed by the chaotic preparations for the upcoming G7 summit in Évian-les-Bains. They focused entirely on the aggressive trade rhetoric coming from Washington. They completely missed the real story. For the past 18 months, President Donald Trump has maintained a brutal economic chokehold on Ottawa. The White House applied sweeping tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, publicly dismissed Canadian sovereignty, and treated the nation as if it were merely the 51st state of the American Union. Mainstream economists declared that Canada was cornered, possessing zero leverage against the overwhelming economic might of the United States. They told the public that Ottawa would inevitably capitulate to every single demand made by President Donald Trump. That assessment is completely incorrect. The document that Mark Carney and French President Emmanuel Macron finalized in Paris changes the entire equation. It is a comprehensive security of information agreement that unlocks massive defense procurement contracts and builds a permanent intelligence sharing framework. More importantly, it cements Canada as the host of the new Defense Security and Resilience Bank, an independent multilateral financial institution designed to fund allied defense projects without utilizing Washington-aligned capital markets. This is not an improvised diplomatic courtesy visit. Mark Carney is executing a highly sequenced, cold-blooded strategy of geopolitical hedging. Instead of fighting President Donald Trump directly, Canada is actively constructing a parallel infrastructure across the European continent. This alternative architecture ensures that future Canadian policy decisions no longer require the rubber stamp of approval from the White House. This strategic move fundamentally shifts the balance of power before the leaders even sit down at the negotiating table in Évian-les-Bains next week. Mainstream commentators want the public to believe that Canada is helpless against American economic nationalism. The reality is that Ottawa is quietly isolating Washington by locking in deep structural alliances with America's most capable military partners. This redefines the entire defense and technology relationship between North America and Europe. The economic safety of domestic industries, from aerospace manufacturing in Calgary, Alberta, to quantum research facilities in Waterloo, Ontario, is being insulated from American volatility. President Donald Trump believed his blunt force pressure would force total submission. President Donald Trump miscalculated. At exactly 2:15 p.m. Central European Time on June 12, 2026, Mark Carney walked through the heavy wooden doors of the corner office inside the Élysée Palace. This was not a standard diplomatic meeting. This was a carefully timed execution. While mainstream media networks focused on Washington, Mark Carney was conducting his very first official foreign trip since taking office. He did not go to Washington to plead with President Donald Trump. He flew straight to Paris to meet French President Emmanuel Macron. The relationship between these two men is deep, forged when Mark Carney ran the Bank of England from 2013 to 2020, while Emmanuel Macron was building his political career. They understand each other perfectly. They speak the exact same language of structural financial architecture. At 3:40 p.m., following a private discussion that lasted exactly 85 minutes, the two men signed the General Security of Information Agreement, known as the GSIA. Mainstream journalists looked at the title and dismissed it as routine paperwork. They were blind to the mechanics. The GSIA is a legal crowbar. By establishing this specific intelligence sharing framework, Canada and France instantly unlocked restricted defense procurement contracts. It allowed their defense industries to bypass standard bureaucratic barriers, bid on sensitive military projects, and integrate supply chains deeply. It removed Washington from the approval chain. At 4:10 p.m., the Élysée Palace issued a joint communiqué that sent shockwaves through the back rooms of the Pentagon. The announcement confirmed that Canada would officially host the headquarters of the Defense Security and Resilience Bank, or the DSRB. This multilateral financial institution, which concluded its charter negotiations in Montreal back in April, is designed to provide long-term, low-cost financing for critical defense and security projects. President Donald Trump has spent years using the American banking system to bully allies, threatening to cut off nations that do not meet his transactional demands. Mark Carney answered by laying financial piping. The DSRB allows allied countries to fund vital defense supply chains, especially small and medium enterprises, without ever touching Washington-aligned capital markets. The contrast between these leaders is absolute. On one side is President Donald Trump, a leader who relies on blunt force economic pressure, sudden overnight tariffs, and aggressive public rhetoric to force submission. On the other side is Mark Carney, a cold, systematic financial technocrat who thinks in structural terms. Mark Carney does not care about the next news cycle. He cares about the 24-month transmission mechanism of financial policy. While President Donald Trump uses the sledgehammer of trade blockades, Mark Carney uses the scalpel of institutional engineering. This Paris Agreement is a direct response to the aggressive behavior originating from the White House since early 2025. President Donald Trump treated Canada like an economic dependency, believing Ottawa had no choice but to absorb the pain of his unilateral tariffs. President Donald Trump believed that the sheer scale of the American market gave him a permanent veto over Canadian sovereignty. He believed Canada would break. He was wrong. Mark Carney did not react emotionally to the pressure. Mark Carney used the pressure as political cover to accelerate a massive geopolitical diversification strategy. This is the ultimate example of geopolitical hedging. By the time the meeting concluded at 5 p.m., Canada had established a parallel infrastructure in Europe. The message sent to Washington was unmistakable. The trap was sprung. To understand why this structural shift is happening now, you must look beneath the surface of mainstream news reporting. For over 70 years, Canada operated under an asymmetric geopolitical arrangement. Ottawa outsourced its primary defense architecture and economic security to the United States. Every major policy decision, every advanced technology deployment, and every cross-border investment flow was filtered through the approval mechanisms of Washington. This deep integration was marketed to the Canadian public as a permanent shield of stability. In reality, it was an extreme systemic vulnerability. The moment President Donald Trump entered the White House and began treating international relations as a zero-sum transactional game, that vulnerability became an immediate threat to Canadian sovereignty. Do not look at the political handshakes between Mark Carney and Emmanuel Macron. Look at the raw strategic assets. The agreement finalized in Paris is not a symbolic gesture of historical friendship. It is a calculated offensive designed to secure independent control over the two most valuable resources of the next century: sovereign financial capital and quantum technology supremacy. The first critical layer hidden beneath the surface is the complete decoupling of defense financing from the American banking system. For decades, Canadian defense contractors, particularly small and medium enterprises, were entirely dependent on Wall Street capital markets to scale their operations. If a Canadian firm wanted to build advanced components for North Atlantic Treaty Organization procurement, they had to secure funding through institutions that ultimately answer to the United States Federal Reserve and Washington regulators. President Donald Trump repeatedly weaponized this financial dominance, using the threat of banking exclusions to dictate terms to foreign partners. The creation of the Defense Security and Resilience Bank, headquartered on Canadian soil with major operational hubs planned for Montreal and Toronto, completely smashes this monopoly. Mark Carney is establishing a parallel financial infrastructure that provides long-term, low-cost capital directly to allied defense supply chains. This ensures that Canadian industrial projects can scale up, manufacture, and export without ever requiring a permission slip from the United States Treasury Department. The second layer is even more critical for the future balance of power. It is the integration of quantum science and technology frameworks. Mainstream media networks treat quantum computing as a distant science fiction concept. Mark Carney and Emmanuel Macron view it as the foundational infrastructure for the next generation of global dominance. Canada possesses extraordinary world-class quantum assets, including the Institute for Quantum Computing in Waterloo, Ontario, and advanced materials research facilities in Vancouver, British Columbia. France has poured billions of euros into developing its own state-sponsored quantum ecosystem. By locking in a joint quantum cooperation framework alongside the Defense Intelligence Agreement, these two nations are building a secure supply chain for quantum encryption, quantum sensing, and next-generation military computing. This alliance guarantees that the intellectual property and commercial capabilities developed in Waterloo or Paris remain entirely outside the legislative reach of Washington. This prevents the United States from unilaterally restricting Canadian tech exports under the guise of American national security regulations. Mark Carney is not merely managing a trade dispute with President Donald Trump. Mark Carney is executing a profound structural shift. He is moving Canada away from a position of absolute dependency on a single, unpredictable superpower. He is positioning the nation as a sovereign, indispensable node in a new, multipolar global architecture. This is not about conventional diplomacy. This is about rewriting the rules of global power. President Donald Trump believed that his economic warfare would cripple Canada. He believed that threatening severe tariffs and mocking Ottawa would leave the nation isolated, weak, and compliant. But his strategy produced the exact opposite result. This is the classic boomerang effect. The intense economic pressure applied by the White House since early 2025 did not break Canada. Instead, it became the ultimate forcing function. It gave Mark Carney the perfect political cover and urgency to do what was once considered completely impossible: aggressively build a parallel infrastructure that bypasses the United States entirely. Now let us examine the receipts. The hard data proves that this diversification is not a distant theory. It is happening right now. Look at the trade numbers. Total merchandise trade between Canada and France reached $15.2 billion in 2025 alone. That is an increase of nearly 23% over the past 10 years. Canadian exports to France have climbed to $5 billion, while imports sit at $10.2 billion. France has officially become the third largest export market for Canada within the European Union. These are not vague future projections. These are concrete facts established before Mark Carney even arrived in Paris. The boomerang effect is visible in the physical manufacturing sector as well. Look at the aerospace industry. The French government recently finalized the acquisition of two de Havilland Canada 515 water bomber aircraft manufactured by de Havilland Aircraft of Canada in Calgary, Alberta. This is not a symbolic gesture. This is a deliberate decision by a major European military power to embed Canadian manufacturing directly into its state procurement chain. This means high-paying industrial jobs in Calgary are now tied straight to Paris, completely insulated from the volatile trade policies of President Donald Trump. The financial receipts are even more devastating for Washington. President Donald Trump has consistently used a transactional approach to threaten the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, demanding that allies pay their share or lose protection. He thought this would shatter Allied unity. He was wrong. The pressure forced allied nations to design independent financing mechanisms. The multilateral negotiations for the charter of the Defense Security and Resilience Bank were quietly and successfully concluded in Montreal in April 2026. This bank represents a profound shift in how international defense projects secure capital. Instead of waiting for Wall Street approval, allied nations can now bypass American financial institutions completely. To completely neutralize the criticisms coming from the White House, Canada officially met the North Atlantic Treaty Organization target of spending 2% of its gross domestic product on defense this fiscal year. Furthermore, Ottawa has established a clear pathway to reach 5% by 2035. By forcing Canada into a corner, President Donald Trump inadvertently accelerated the creation of a parallel infrastructure he cannot control. Mark Carney is not acting out of weakness. He is acting out of immense leverage. When Mark Carney walks into the Group of Seven summit in Évian-les-Bains next week, he will not be pleading for relief from American tariffs. He will be sitting across from President Donald Trump, backed by a signed defense agreement, a world-class quantum partnership, and a newly established sovereign defense bank on Canadian soil. President Donald Trump wanted total submission. Instead, he created a self-reliant global competitor. The economic weapon of Washington has officially backfired. These massive macroeconomic shifts and high-level treaties signed inside the Élysée Palace can easily feel completely disconnected from your day-to-day life. A multi-billion-dollar trade dispute between President Donald Trump and Mark Carney does not immediately change the price of the groceries you buy next week, nor does it instantly alter the interest rate on your mortgage payment this month. But beneath the surface, the transmission mechanism of this historic deal is moving rapidly toward your doorstep. This agreement is a structural shield designed to directly protect your livelihood, your employment, and your personal financial stability from the economic volatility originating from the White House. Consider the concrete reality for specialized workers and local business owners. For decades, small and medium enterprises across Canada specializing in aerospace, advanced manufacturing, and cybersecurity were completely locked out of major international procurement contracts. They could not compete because they lacked access to the massive capital required to scale up operations, and American financial institutions routinely prioritized domestic firms. The establishment of the Defense Security and Resilience Bank on Canadian soil completely changes this dynamic. This new institution provides long-term, low-cost financing specifically designed for these exact companies. Technicians, engineers, and suppliers within these industrial supply chains now possess a direct pipeline to secure European defense contracts without ever needing to route through the restrictive regulations of the United States Treasury Department. This parallel infrastructure guarantees that your employment is no longer dependent on the unpredictable trade whims of President Donald Trump. The impact on the technology sector is equally direct. The Joint Quantum Science and Technology Framework creates an immediate commercial highway between Canadian research hubs and European markets. Professionals working in software development, data science, or advanced materials research in Waterloo, Ontario, or Vancouver, British Columbia gain an immediate advantage. Instead of watching domestic innovations get swallowed up by American tech conglomerates or restricted by sudden export bans issued from Washington, Canadian firms now hold protected pathways to collaborate with European partners and access sovereign funding structures. This structure ensures that the high-paying tech jobs of the next decade remain domestic, building long-term wealth within your local community rather than draining capital to Silicon Valley. This is how geopolitical hedging functions at the kitchen table level. Mark Carney is not merely engaging in abstract diplomacy. He is actively laying down financial and technological piping to insulate the domestic economy from a hostile trading partner. When President Donald Trump applies blunt force economic pressure, his strategy relies on your local factory closing, your wages stagnating, and your community suffering until Ottawa surrenders. The parallel infrastructure built in Paris stands as the antidote to that economic blackmail. It shifts the entire industrial trajectory of major cities over the next 10 years. It converts systemic vulnerability into tangible economic sovereignty, ensuring that the money in your bank account is protected. The global chessboard is now completely set for the G7 summit in Évian-les-Bains. Mark Carney walks into his very first face-to-face encounter with President Donald Trump since the escalation of global geopolitical tensions, backed by a fortified European alliance. This high-stakes confrontation will determine the ultimate success of the diversification strategy of Canada over the next 3 to 6 months. 3 distinct scenarios will now dictate the immediate future of this international struggle. The first and most likely scenario involves the steady, systematic operationalization of the Paris agreements. Over the next 90 days, the GSIA begins unlocking specific defense procurement contracts, allowing Canadian manufacturers to secure lucrative European tenders. Concurrently, the DSRB moves rapidly from charter negotiations to active capital deployment on Canadian soil. President Donald Trump continues his aggressive tariff rhetoric on social media, but his economic leverage steadily degrades as Canadian industries successfully route their financing and exports through this newly established parallel infrastructure. The second and best-case scenario is a profound diplomatic reset driven by genuine Canadian optionality. When President Donald Trump realizes that his blunt force economic pressure has failed to break Ottawa and has instead forced Canada to construct an independent financial and technological axis with France, the White House changes its calculations. To prevent the permanent loss of American influence over Canadian defense supply chains and quantum technology, President Donald Trump offers a comprehensive tariff truce during the meetings in Évian-les-Bains. In this scenario, Canada achieves the ultimate goal of geopolitical hedging, negotiating a return to stable trade relations from a position of absolute strength rather than absolute desperation. The third and most dangerous scenario is an aggressive escalation of economic warfare combined with political fragility in Europe. President Donald Trump responds to the Paris Agreement by implementing sweeping secondary sanctions against any European entity that utilizes the DSRB or collaborates with Canadian quantum research facilities. Simultaneously, the highly fragmented domestic political coalition of French President Emmanuel Macron suffers a severe crisis in Paris, paralyzing the French government and completely weakening their long-term commitment to the alliance. This leaves Canada completely exposed to intensified American retaliation, while its primary European partner is distracted by internal chaos. The ultimate story of the past 18 months is not about individual tariffs, political personalities, or a single diplomatic visit to France. It is a profound structural examination of what it truly means to be a sovereign nation in a modern world where great power competition has returned with absolute brutality. For decades, Canada accepted the comfortable illusion that absolute economic dependency on a single massive neighbor was synonymous with national stability. The sudden actions of the White House expose that arrangement as a fatal strategic liability. The historic agreements signed in Paris demonstrate that true sovereignty is not granted through the benevolence of a superpower. It must be actively engineered through parallel infrastructure and calculated institutional design. The fundamental choice facing the nation is clear. You must decide whether it is wiser to remain tethered to the volatile and unpredictable market of the United States, hoping for a return to traditional stability, or to accept the immense financial costs and geopolitical risks required to build a completely independent path alongside European allies. You are invited to share your perspective on this historic crossroads in the comments below as the global order reshapes itself before our eyes.